and reading what other people have to say. But let's go straight to our first question. The panel don't, of course, know what these questions are going to be. And this comes from Stan Semple, please. Mr. Semple.
Would you agree that Saddam Hussein was the biggest weapon of mass destruction in Iraq, therefore justifying the action taken?
Alex Salmond.
Well, like everybody else, I'm pleased that we see the back of Saddam Hussein. I'm not quite sure if he's in hiding or under a restaurant somewhere or whatever it is. I just know there wouldn't be many folk at the funeral if indeed he is dead. But I think if you're going to have a war, you have to have a legal justification for war. And I think there are now severe question marks over the credibility of that justification and indeed over the integrity of the government and the Prime Minister. Because if we just cast our minds back a little, we were told that the justification, the prime reason, was to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. And all I would say is, having looked at the Prime Minister's evasions over the last few days, I know there is now substantial doubt as to the integrity of the information that was presented to people in order to try and persuade us of that argument. I take but just one example. The Prime Minister yesterday in the House of Commons refused to acknowledge that information about Iraqi imports of uranium from Niger was untrue. And yet we actually know from the International Atomic Energy Agency that the documents which supported that claim were total fabrications. Now, if a Prime Minister, after the event, 3 months after that was proven, can't even allow himself to admit that point of fact, I think we're entitled to question the basis on which he led this country into war.
John Redwood, would you agree that Saddam Hussein was the biggest weapon of mass destruction and therefore justified the action that was taken?
I think he was a very evil man, leading an extremely unpleasant regime, so I think none of us will be worried about his passing.
Not quite what the question was.
But I'm going on to answer the question. My answer is, along with Alex Salmond, that I think there does need to be a clear moral and legal basis for the action that our country took. And I and some of my colleagues are now very concerned that the basis of the action is not as described to us in the House of Commons before the very important vote. We want to know where these weapons of mass destruction are. We were told they existed. They're having some difficulty in finding them. And we want to know why it was that the Prime Minister told us in terms that there were weapons now that could reach us within 45 minutes, that they were very potent and very dangerous. And now there seems to be some backing away from that very important statement. Now, the loyal opposition has to be able to trust the word of the Prime Minister on matters of national security in the House of Commons. Otherwise, the democratic system cannot work. So it is terribly important that we have a full and wide-ranging independent inquiry, as we did after the Falklands, to get to the bottom of the truth of this. Did the Prime Minister tell us the truth, or did he lie? And if he lied, then there must be serious consequences from that. As Mr. Healey rightly said, the Prime Minister has to go if he lied to the country in the House.
Una King.
Well, I think if you're talking about why we went to war, we didn't go to war because there was one report from one source saying that Iraq had weapons that could be used within 45 minutes. We went to war because in '91, after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, the United Nations gave him 14 days to get rid of his weapons, which were then verified by the United Nations weapons inspectors. And they said, for example, he hasn't accounted for 10,000 litres of anthrax, he hasn't accounted for between 80 and 800 tonnes of mustard gas, he hasn't accounted for VX nerve agent, etc., etc., etc. Pages and pages, 107 pages actually, just in March this year. And what we went to war for was firstly to say that if you have 17 UN resolutions saying that someone has to abide by the international law that is there, then it should be enforced. Secondly, on the question of where are the weapons, I think there are three possibilities. Either he never had them, and everyone was wrong, and even Saddam Hussein was wrong because he admitted having them, but that's a possibility, he never had them. Or he destroyed them, or he hid them. Now, if he did destroy them, why would he not have provided even a tiny bit of the evidence? I mean, he has kept records of all the human beings he disposed of, all the mass graves, all the rest of it, all the bureaucracy behind the people he tortured, etc., etc. It just isn't credible to me. Those are the only three possibilities. In my view, if you had to choose which is the most likely, did he never have them, did he destroy them, or did he hide them, it's my judgment that the third is the most likely.
Then why don't we publish the intelligence report that all the fuss is about? Why doesn't the Prime Minister simply publish it and clear it all up?
Before you answer his question, answer the questioner's question, which is, was Saddam Hussein himself the biggest weapon of mass destruction, and did his removal justify the action taken? From your point of view, if there were no weapons, whatever the view about the weapons of mass destruction, is the removal of Saddam a justifiable, or was it a justifiable war aim on its own?
Entirely on its own, I would not say it is the only thing you can use to go to war. He is the biggest weapon of mass destruction because he's responsible for over 1 million deaths, and we have no single weapon or individual leader in recent time who has been responsible for the deaths of 1 million people, all Muslim, might I add. So I don't think, you know, you can say he's not a weapon of mass destruction. I agree with the questioner. He is a weapon of mass destruction.
OK, let me just go back to the questioner. From what you've heard,
I just wanted to say that. I mean, he's killed millions of people. How much more mass destruction do you want?
So the weapons of mass destruction, from your point of view,
well, I mean,
he's what matters, not them.
There's also the point is, OK, right, you can have weapons that will destroy hundreds of thousands of people or thousands of people in a few days, or you'll get weapons that will kill the same amount of people but over a slightly longer time. I mean, just... You know, the world's a far better place without him.
What's your reaction to what John Redwood says, then, about the Prime Minister misleading the House of Commons, or what Alex Salmond says?
I hear what he's saying, yeah.
What?
I hear what he's saying.
And what does that mean?
Well, next question.
OK. You, sir, down here in the second row.
It's got nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction or Saddam Hussein. If you use that theory, the Blair government would have not supported Suharto. Suharto murdered probably 1 million people in 1966. He got rid of 1/3 of the population of East Timor, 1/3 of a population of a small island the size, a bit bigger than Shetland. And the Tories supported Saddam Hussein when they were in power before the Gulf War.
So it's not the person?
It's not the person. Pinochet was a guest. Pinochet murdered thousands of people in...
OK. Muriel Gray.
Well, to answer Mr. Semple's question, he is he was a weapon of mass destruction. We all have weapons of mass destruction in the West. We have enough to wipe out the globe. They're only as good as the person who's willing to press the button. The difficulty was he was a weapon when we were still selling him arms, and we did very little about it. I recognise what you're getting at with the question, though, about the reasons for going to war. And, Una, the difficulty is that this is such an emotional issue for the British public because people needed to trust Blair. It was one of the single most emotional political issues I can remember just in the last decade. People were torn apart by this issue, and they really felt that they had to trust him. And with these latest revelations, there are no weapons, there might never have been any weapons, that trust has been seriously undermined. It was seriously undermined as well by the company he's been keeping to. I mean, let's face it, it's like when your children go off with a bad crowd. Let's face it, the Bush administration, and by that I mean the people who administer Bush, because he's obviously not a man who's capable of coherent thought. So they have proved themselves to be, since the awful events in Florida, the presidential elections, to be, I think, and I don't think this is too strong a word for it, a corrupt administration. Now, those are not the sort of people that we should be friendly with in such an important issue. Therefore, I'm very worried about this. And unless Blair has an independent inquiry into the way that that war was put to us, I think it's really going to undermine this government.
You've said about these revelations that all of a sudden there aren't any weapons. I mean, we're not going to find a neon light in the desert saying weapons of mass destruction buried here. The teams have just gone in now because the very first priority, because the very first priority had had to be getting security into Iraq. And that has not yet been, you know, that has not entirely happened. But the other idea that this is a question about how much we loathe President Bush is really missing the issue. I mean, for example, I would hope that everybody here wants to see action in the Middle East, wants to see America change its policy there. The question is, how do you influence the superpower to change that policy?
Jim Wallace?
Well, I mean, to answer Mr. Semple's question, no, I don't think that just getting rid of Saddam Hussein was justification for a war. If we were to live in a world where countries with bigger might took out governments that they didn't like, albeit pretty nasty governments, as the person who contributed down here said, there's been a good number of them, then that is a recipe for international instability. And who gives us the moral right to say which governments or which leaders should be taken out and which shouldn't? Tony Blair's justification for this war was that there were weapons of mass destruction, that they were there, that they could be deployed against British interests, and indeed, on the basis of what we now know to be uncorroborated evidence, that they could actually be dispatched within 45 minutes. Now, there hasn't been any evidence that these weapons of mass destruction exist. And when Tony Blair said yesterday, give him time, that's the very time that he would not allow the United Nations arms inspectors. And I think nothing less than an independent judicial inquiry is what is required, with full powers to call anyone to give evidence and to look at all papers.
Right. The woman at the very back there on the left.
Yeah, I believe as a consequence of this war, Britain has sacrificed its security.
Okay. And you, sir, in the front here, in the middle?
I do believe that certain questions certainly need to be asked and answered. But I would make a plea for the loved ones of those who have laid down their lives in the conflict, that we consider them and express our deepest sympathy continually to them. Meanwhile, we ask questions, but we must never forget them.
But that point's well made.
And you, sir? You, sir,
we
the
all
white shirt here. Hold on.
Forces did.
Hold on a second,
is
John.
Whether the government told the truth.
Hold on, the gentleman in white here.
I would just like to pick up on the point about the relationship between Bush and Blair. I think the point was made about influencing the American president, but I think the regime in America is very worrying. They definitely have an agenda. I mean, where are they going to stop in terms of invading other countries? And I find it very worrying that our Prime Minister seems to simply accede to what the US government wants.
Right. John Redwood, does that worry you as well? I mean, are you dubious about the American presidency and the people around in the way Muriel Gray was describing?
Well, I certainly don't agree with Muriel's comments on the president. No, this is the leader of the free world, who is a man of well, you try becoming president of the United States of America. It's not easy to become it. And this is a man who is offering a great deal to his own people and is very popular at home. And I do agree with Una that the United Kingdom needs to have a strong, positive relationship with the United States. We need to influence them for the better when we have disagreements and we think we have some good ideas. What worried me about the position we were placed in the House of Commons was that we got ourselves into a position where if we'd voted no to the war, we couldn't stop the war because the United States was obviously fully committed, but we'd have let down a very important ally, because I don't think our Prime Minister handled the diplomacy and had the right amount of influence early enough in the discussions. Another thing I would like to know from our Prime Minister is when did he actually agree to go to war? Is Claire Short right that he agreed to go to war months before we went to war?
John, there has to be more.
The House of Commons was placed in a difficult position.
There has to be more to United Kingdom foreign policy on a moment of international crisis than to say, I agree with the President of the United States. I mean, there must be an articulation of... Now, well, yes, you argue...
If you look at the resolutions that were put to the United Nations in 1998, before, I was going to say before... Listen,
if it had been going on that long,
Alex,
then why didn't you give the inspectors the time?
We can't go... Hold on a second, everybody. We can't go right back over all this argument.
No, but the fact is that the British government,
and was clearly about weapons of mass destruction and whether they'd been found. Well, in answer... So let's stick to that. All right.
Unimix the point about the...
I don't know. I don't want to go way back over the history because we've done that several times and we can't do it now. The woman there, please. Otherwise, we'll never get through any of the long list of questions we've got here. Yes, you, madam.
Are we not part of Europe and not one of the United States states? Surely, no matter how many arguments that Europe brought up, whether it was 107 or 1,007, the United States said we were to go to war, and that's what happened.
Well, this is the point I'd like to make that I was trying to say a minute ago to Alex. The British government put a UN, or sponsored a UN resolution which was very, very similar to the one that we voted on recently, and this was in 1998, talking about the threat posed by Saddam Hussein. This happened before George Bush, I was going to say before he was elected, he was never elected, let's just say before he became the American president. But this was something that concerned our government from the very word go, and if you don't believe me, go and look at the record of Hansard as well in 1998. We were interested in this issue because we felt it affected our security before George Bush was...
I don't know, to answer the lady's point, I don't know if the consequences of the war, this thing about the Eurovision Song Contest getting nil point, but I do think there must be a lot of people across Europe who are expecting a bit more from the British government to be the sort of American fifth column when it comes to international issues. And I think that's a substantial point, and we should find a different role than merely lying down whoever's in the White House and saying our international policy is we'll take the White House line. There must be more to it than that.
No, all right. Hold on. We've got a lot of people with their hands up. We've got a lot of questions. I think I'll just take a couple more points from the audience, if I may. I'll take you, sir, on the left here.
I think the American Time magazine summed it up themselves so well this week by saying that it was weapons of mass disappearance. That's their headline.
Okay. And I'll take one other person, you, sir, the man in blue here. Be brief if you would, because we've got a lot to get through.
Yes, I'm not surprised Tony Blair has problems over this. I think that Britain and America were very keen to attack Iraq, and that's why they didn't give Hans Blix the time he needed. And I really do think this is about the extension of American power and influence in the oil-rich Middle East. I think that's the real issue here, and if anything, this vindicates the case put by the anti-war movement throughout this crisis, and that is why, Una King, large numbers of Labour Party members in Scotland and elsewhere have left your party because they are thoroughly disgusted with the record of your Prime Minister on this.
I recognise the views on that, but the point... Are you going to let me come back on this?
Well, be very brief.
Well, the point is that people have to recognise that there are very genuinely held views on both sides. I had to weigh up the human cost as well before I voted. It is my genuine belief that when I had letters from Labour Party members and others saying that I would be responsible for a Vietnam, saying that the Middle East would be in flames, saying that the whole thing would be a catastrophe and that none of the ends would be achieved, I believe that was incorrect, and I believe that the numbers of people who will die in Iraq, the civilians, we now know that he killed 200,000 of his own civilians. Now, those civilians now are not going to face those same things. Okay. And you just have to recognise that there are genuinely held beliefs on both sides of this argument.
All right.